Oh, I hate being disappointed, Steve. And I hate living in this flawed body. And I hate living in Neverland. And I hate Peter Pan!
This is Next Door Villain.
I'm Tiana.
I'm Joe.
In this podcast, we practice empathy by discussing fictional villains.
Because if we can learn to understand characters that were designed to be hated, then we might just have a chance of understanding the real-life villains we encounter every day.
Today we're going to be talking about the infamous villain Captain Hook from the original play and movies Peter Pan. The original play was written by J.M. Barrie.
This is one instance where there are just so many interpretations of the Peter Pan story out there that I don't know that we could encompass all of them in our conversations, but we tried to get the core of who Captain Hook is into our conversation.
Right, and a lot of them are quite similar to one another, but with a few variations that we'll be sure to talk about and make note of as we go along. Mm-hmm. So Captain Hook, some people might be interested in learning about Captain Hook, some people might not be. Joe, why are we talking about this villain?
Well, when I was a kid, my brothers and I would play Peter Pan, and I was always forced to be Captain Hook. And I hated that because he was the villain, and I wanted to be Peter Pan because he was the hero, like all kids. But now that I'm older, and especially since we started doing research for this podcast, I've started to realize that the story is a lot more complex than that there's a lot more to Captain Hook than just this terrible villain who's trying to kill children. He might even have some redeeming qualities, and so I'm super excited to delve into that conversation today and figure some of that stuff out.
Right, yeah, and even when I was younger, I would go see the Peter Pan play a lot at the University Theater. For some reason, they always had Peter Pan playing. I don't know why. I think they just didn't know what else to show. So me and my mom would go there a lot, and I would be very interested in Peter Pan. And I thought it was cool that he could fly. And, when both of us, when we were younger, we were taught to kind of think of Captain Hook as the evil one and not very cool and kind of annoying at times. But now, of course, that we're older, we can kind of look at Captain Hook and kind of see a few different sides to him. Mm-hmm. So for those of us who may not have seen Peter Pan in a while, either the movies or the play, maybe the last time we saw Peter Pan was when we were maybe 6 to 10 years old, around that age. So Joe, would you be able to remind us as to who Captain Hook specifically is in Peter Pan?
Yes. Captain Hook. His full name is James Hook, and he is the captain of the pirate ship the Jolly Roger, which exists in this magical place called Neverland. And Neverland, of course, is most famous for being where Peter Pan lives, and Peter Pan is this child who just refuses to grow up. And we don't really know Hook's full story, but we do know that he has this long-standing rivalry with Peter, and that at one point in time, Peter chopped off his hand in battle and fed it to a crocodile. And then Hook replaced his lost hand with a hook, which is where he got his name from, I'm assuming. And now he has this long-standing rivalry with Peter, and it seems to be his life's mission to take Peter down. So I want to start the conversation today by asking you why you think Hook is so intent on taking out Peter? Like, what is motivating him to seek revenge?
Right. So the obvious reason, which you kind of touched on too, was the fact that when they were in battle, Peter Pan cut off Captain Hook's hand. And we can assume that Captain Hook was also holding a clock, and then that clock and hand was swallowed up by the crocodile. And so now this crocodile follows Captain Hook wherever he goes, and you hear this tick-tock noise that follows him that basically reminds him that he's in danger and that he's vulnerable because he knows that this crocodile is capable of killing him And I think Captain Hook really blames him for that. And even just hearing that noise over and over again, I can see how Captain Hook is going to be reminded about what Peter Pan did to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on top of that, that ticking clock kind of has this metaphorical meaning that is like a reminder of mortality,
Mm-hmm.
which is in direct opposition to Peter, who's a child who can't grow up, is that Hook is an adult who is growing older and has to face mortality. And it's just, so in addition to the reminder that Peter chopped off his hand and now this crocodile is chasing him and trying to eat him, there's also this reminder that eventually he is going to die, mm-hmm. and that Peter is going to live forever.
Right. And it's a clock. So that basically says that his time is going to come to an end sometime. That's the whole reason why it's a clock.
Yeah. And that's a scary thought,
mm-hmm.
that things are coming to an end.
Right. And then another kind of fun fact that's a little off topic is that in Chinese culture, it is not good to give a gift of a clock to someone, because it represents that their time will come to an end. And the word clock in Chinese also sounds like the word the end in Chinese as well. So I think in some ways, Captain Hook and that kind of small tidbit about Chinese culture have something in common. And, it's definitely something that's not new to think about the clock as a way as the end is coming.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So then I think another reason why Captain Hook will want to seek revenge on Peter Pan is just the fact that Captain Hook seems to be very sad and very distressed and an anxious person. And I believe that he thinks Peter Pan has a lot to do with that.
Mm-hmm. Where do you get that from him? Like what evidence do you see that he is sad or depressed in the stories?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So in the cartoon version for the movie, first of all, there's a scene where he's sad, also because he's sick, because I believe he fell in the water because Peter Pan was playing a trick on him. And he starts saying like, oh, Peter Pan, how he's humiliated me. And he gets kind of sad with a mixture of anger about it. And then also in the 2003 version, Wendy tells Captain Hook that he can fly if he thinks happy thoughts. And Captain Hook says, alas, I cannot think of any happy thoughts. And also throughout the film, he seems to look at Wendy and Peter Pan with this viewpoint that they seem to be so happy. He seems to almost be jealous. And I think just seeing the Lost Boys and Peter Pan and how happy they are and that they can play pranks while he's there with his alcohol and he has a ship to manage, and he's just there with thinking about why can they be so happy when I can't be, and I can't think any happy thoughts. And throughout both films, he has just these mixed feelings of anger and sadness and anxiousness, not only because of the crocodile, but because of Peter Pan. It just contributes to his overall well-being.
Yeah, and besides the feelings that he already has, Peter Pan and the Lost Boys are like a literal representation of this thing that he no longer has, which is this youth and this happiness. And then he's got the ticking clock from the crocodile. And it's like the weight of all these things is bearing down on him and he can't move on from it. And as someone who has like really high anxiety myself, like one of the toughest things is getting my mind off of the things that are worrying me. And I like to run the things that are worrying me over and over and over again in my mind. But Captain Hook, those things that are worrying him are constantly showing up in his life. Peter, who is a child who doesn't grow up, who is eternally young, and this clock that's ticking, and this crocodile who's following him around, reminding him that someday he's going to die.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think having that revenge and taking that revenge can also help with filling emotional gaps that he might have. It might not be very effective, but I think he's going to keep trying to, maybe he thinks deep down, in order for me to be happy, I really need to get revenge on Peter Pan because he keeps humiliating me. He keeps playing these tricks on me. So I really got to get to him. Otherwise, I'm going to keep being sad. And you just see that throughout the films. Mm-hmm. So another thing, the whole story of Peter Pan has a lot of metaphors to it. So a lot of hidden meanings behind the story and the characters and why they do what they do. In the original play of Peter Pan, the actor who plays the father of Wendy and the Darling children, so Mr. Darling, that same actor plays Captain Hook. And it's not meaningless. I don't think that actor just needed more lines, so then they gave him 2 parts. It's something that has been planned. So I guess what can we understand about Captain Hook if we know that they essentially might be the same person?
That's a really interesting question. And I think it really opens up the door for a whole new understanding of who Captain Hook is. So for a little bit of background, at the beginning of the Peter Pan story, we meet the Darling children, and Mr. Darling is their father, and he's not a very good parent. He spends a lot of time at work. He doesn't spend much time with his children. He's very angry. He's yelling a lot. But then Peter comes in and takes the children away. And it's almost like this eye-opening experience for Mr. Darling where he realizes how terrible of a parent he was and he misses his children so badly. And in the original story, he is so upset that he actually decides to stay in the dog kennel to punish himself. Mm-hmm. So he's forced to confront the fact that he's been this terrible father. And so if we view Captain Hook as essentially the same character, we can, I guess, kind of view Captain Hook's story as trying to save the Darling children from Peter, who took them away from their home. And he's trying to redeem himself by bringing the children back from this evil fairy child who's stolen them away.
Right. So then do you think that we can view Hook as the hero of the story rather than the villain?
Yes. And maybe I'm being hopeful, but I really do think this is a story where Hook can be viewed as the hero. Mm-hmm. I was doing a little bit of reading about this beforehand, and actually it turns out that Captain Hook wasn't even in the original idea for the story. Mm-hmm. And if you think about that, then the real villain has to be Peter, who is stealing children away from their home and taking them to Neverland. Mm-hmm. So I definitely think there's room to argue that Hook is trying to save the children from Peter Pan in actuality, making him the true hero of the story.
Mm-hmm. And then to get even more metaphorical, basically it's kind of assumed that the lost boys and the people and the children in Neverland are those who died in the mortal world, and then now they're in some sort of purgatory where they need to be prepared to go into the next part, the next heaven. And so they need to be prepared to be grown up in purgatory or Neverland in order to go into heaven and to move on and to accept death. And so, of course, when we did a lot of research about this, it sounded like Captain Hook was not only trying to help the Darling children to go back to the mortal world, but also helping children, the lost boys in purgatory, grow up so that they could go into the next part of the afterlife because they had already died in the mortal world.
Mm-hmm. Like Peter's trapping them in Neverland, not allowing them to move on.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think, and even just having walking the plank might even be part of that transition into helping the lost boys and the children who have died to go into the next afterlife, which sounds very morbid. But when you read Peter Pan, it's sort of the metaphors that come to light as representation. It has a lot of Christian background, of because the writer had that sort of background, and so he's incorporated that in. And Captain Hook then is part of that piece of helping children move on into the next world and thus accepting this death that has come upon them.
Yeah. And that background that the author has that you're referencing, I think, is that when he was young, he had a brother that died at a young age.
Yeah. And his mother was grieving for basically the rest of her life because one of her sons died. She always thought of her son as young because that's how he died. He died when he was very young. And so then the author had pressure to act as if he were young and to not grow up so that he can help his mother realize that in a way his brother was still there because he himself could also act like his brother who was still young. And so he had this pressure to not grow up and move on and accept the death of his brother who had died.
That's one theme in Peter Pan that I think really points to Peter as not being necessarily a hero. At the end of the story, really the children come to realize that they need to grow up. Going to Neverland and having these adventures is fun, but ultimately to have a fulfilling life, they have to grow up and become adults and move on, which kind of leads me into another interpretation of this story, of which there are so many, is that it's a little bit maybe more of a literal interpretation where Peter is this child who can't grow up and he just wants to have these adventures and have fun and be immature. So he steals children to come play with him in Neverland, but then basically holds them captive. Like they think it's fun at first, but then ultimately they realize that they can't be children forever, but they're trapped there by Peter. And those that escape either escape and make it back home or escape and join Captain Hook on the Jolly Roger to help try to defeat Peter to keep him from stealing other children.
Right. And Peter is really aggressive about trying to keep children there and like on his side, especially like in the films, he says, you know, you're going to come away with me to Neverland and you'll never have to come back here again. And we're going to have the greatest time. He's just trying to be so persuasive to keep children in that same place and to never go anywhere, ever.
Yeah, and actually, this just occurred to me. The reason he steals, or the reason he brings Wendy to Neverland is because the Lost Boys are starting to get sad and they're missing having a mother. And he's bringing Wendy in to be a mother figure so that they don't want to escape anymore because they have everything they need right there in Neverland and they'll stay with Peter forever.
Wow. Yeah, so he'll do whatever it takes to keep Wendy and the Darling Children and the Lost Boys in Neverland. And then we can kind of see as Captain Hook as the one who's trying to keep things a move on.
Yeah. You know, any trepidations I had at the beginning of this conversation about viewing Hook as a hero, I think are gone. I'm now on board with Hook can definitely be a hero in the story and Peter can definitely be the villain.
Right. Yeah.
I just had to change my perspective.
Yeah, exactly. You just have to change your perspective. I mean, some listeners listening to this right now might say, oh, well, I can still think of reasons for why Peter Pan might be the actual hero, blah, blah, blah. And we definitely want to hear that. But then if we just think of Captain Hook more deeply, especially with all of these metaphors that the writer himself, the original writer, created for himself, we can definitely see how Captain Hook is more of the hero of the story, even though he is seen as the villain with a hook. And another reason why I kind of see Captain Hook as a hero is because he helps us realize that being an adult and having adult feelings can also be very heroic. Because going back to Captain Hook having feelings, and even though he's an emotional and anxious person, that makes him more relatable. Wendy realizes in the 2003 version of the film that Peter Pan won't love. He won't have the feeling of love because that's an adult feeling. But then when Captain Hook and Wendy talk, when he kidnaps her temporarily and then brings her back, something like that, he says that, oh, you know, feelings, they're not that great, but I have them. And I have a lot of these feelings, which then makes me more of an adult and more of a human that you can really relate to and talk to. And then I think that goes back into the fact that Captain Hook, in a way, is Wendy's father as Mr. Darling. And then so I think she feels very intrigued with him, like, oh, this man has feelings. He knows what he's talking about. He's gone through these experiences as an adult and having this responsibility with feelings. And I can connect with him so much more because we can agree with each other that love is a real feeling and a good feeling to have. And so Wendy starts to see something in Captain Hook. So I think we can also see that in Captain Hook, that he's a man of feeling. And that can also help him be seen as a very respectable individual. And then Peter Pan as more of an incomplete person who doesn't have these feelings that Captain Hook can have. And I know the original writer, Barrie, also made Captain Hook to be kind of a suave, very proper man who had a lot of responsibility and a lot of direction and had a lot of leadership skills, that even though sometimes he can come off as very angry and want to, kill the Lost Boys, he still has a lot of great qualities about him as an adult, because he is an adult and he has those feelings and those responsibilities, and he can just make better decisions as a leader because of that.
Mm-hmm. I really like what you said about Peter Pan being an incomplete character.
Mm-hmm.
I think is that how you put it?
Yeah. And Captain Hook actually says that to Peter Pan. He says, "You're incomplete. I'm complete because I have feelings," or around that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like, Peter is good for children at a particular time in their life, but he's just a part of the full experience. Whereas Captain Hook is an adult who has grown up and he has those complex emotions. Yeah, I really like that.
Mm-hmm.
I've really come to like Captain Hook
right.
as a person and an individual, and I'd love to sit down and have a drink with him.
Right. I think we would be able to relate to him more, especially now that technically we are adults or trying to act like adults at this point in our lives. So maybe we can also take some pointers from him, like, how do you lead? How do you manage these emotions, even though he might not also manage those emotions as well as he could have. But we're all human and we don't always manage emotions very well because he, has a lot of pressure on him that I can tell that he has that.
Yeah. And, we could go a million more ways with this conversation. There's just so much source material and there's such great characters. But that's probably a good place to wrap up our conversation today and to move on.
Now we're ready for the next portion of our podcast, which is featuring a literary piece that someone submits to be showcased on our podcast. And this literary piece centers around the humanity of the villain. If you would like to submit and be featured on our podcast, please go to nextdoorvillain.com, where you can see the list of villains that you have the option of writing for. You can also submit on our website. So today we have a great poem by a freestyle poet named AJ the Wordsmith. He's a freestyle poet based out of the Spokane, Washington area. He also has a website that I think you should check out if you want to check out some of his other great stuff. It's called powertothepoetry.com. Power, then the number 2, thepoetry.com. And he is a freestyle poet, so when he wrote this poem, or recorded it actually, when he recorded this poem, he did it on the fly, which is pretty incredible. So please enjoy this great work of art by AJ the Wordsmith.
Smee. It's happening again. Oh, the noise. Well, Captain, I don't know what to tell you. The clock. The noise that seems to never stop, plaguing him in the back of his mind as if insanity is trying to tell him that he needs to get his mind right.
as if not taking the time to cut off his own left hand would be the thing that he needed to get everything he needed to get the plan, but he's still under attack. Now, let's take a look at things in his perspective. Captain Hook, a man who dedicated his life and will to the sea, with his crew who, at his beck and call, would do anything they could to restore his beliefs. Why is he the bad guy in the story? Because he chose to follow his dreams at an older age than the young man who floated around with nothing but fairy dust and quicksand? He's not perceived as a threat, yet he has a bunch of young boys who follow his beck and whim, scream, chilling, frightful things. What's the point of having Peter Pan if he can't even be a man? Captain Hook may be the best anti-hero of the film. He may be seen as good, he may be seen as bad, but you would never understand if you just seen things in one lens. Was he going around kidnapping kids from their homes at night, taking them to imaginary lands filled with nothing but fright? Did he take the time to sit there and tell anyone what they were supposed to do? Captain Hook simply existed, and he gave Peter Pan a curfew. He didn't take the moments to enforce laws that weren't even fair. Yet you look at him as if he's nothing but despair. But if we took this fantasy story and put some factual truths, then you would understand that Peter Pan is actually the man who took the most out of these youths. And maybe Captain Hook ain't the man that you all claim he should be, but don't some of us say the same thing about stepdads in that same situation, if you know what I mean? So maybe the ticking noise is the sound of death waiting for him. He's fearful of what he may not be able to do. Sure, he likes to play dress up with his son every now and again, and maybe that ain't his biological son. But ever since he found out that he loves pirates and fantasy stories, he thought the best thing to do is to dress up like a pirate. And since he has one false arm anyway from in the war when he protected his comrades in battling battalions of men that he can never even see, he doesn't mind being called a bad guy because he loves his son, and that's his reality.
Once again, that was AJ the Wordsmith with his poem titled Tick-Tock. And that's the end of our show today. If you have any thoughts about Captain Hook, we would love to hear them. You can send us an email at nextdoorvillain@gmail.com. We also have a voicemail line you can call into, and that number is 567-343-3359. Just leave us a message, tell us how you feel, and we might even share it on a future episode. Once again, that number is 567-343-3359. Our show today was produced by us, Joe Anderson and Christiana Hennings. All the artwork and design on our website, nextdoorvillain.com, was done by Eric Anichke. And special thanks to AJ the Wordsmith for sharing his wonderful poem with us. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Google Play. And while you're there, please leave us a review. It's the best way for others to find our show. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.